Hello everyone, hi. Welcome to the third episode of Giffyglyph's Social Encounter. A little 2-hour stream where I talk about Darker Dungeons and Monster Maker, some of the stuff that I've written for D&D 5e in general, and also basically anything else that I'm kind of interested in at the time, which at the moment is N64 video games. So for this episode, we're going to be running through some questions that some people have about my work, and just sort of answering some of those and hopefully helping people get a better idea of how to use these rules in their games. So we'll start straight off with the first question. Question 1. How did you determine the values for damage, bonuses, etc. in Monster Maker? And that's from Coldemos. Thank you, Coldemos. So for those of you who aren't familiar with my work, Darker Dungeons is a sort of 120-page, etc. supplement full of sort of modular rules for 5e. That sort of add a bit more grit and a few more rules options to DMs on like how they want to run their game. And Monster Maker is another supplement that I've written that lets you build monsters in a very sort of 4th edition-y, standardized sort of math kind of way, rather than the challenge rating system that 5e has. So when I first started running 5e, I had a lot of problems kind of when I first started, because I came into D&D from 4th edition, and I love, I've got a great fondness for 4th edition. It's got a lot of problems, but what it does have is a great combat engine, and I'm a DM who likes to run a lot of combat in my games. I love kind of very video gamey, like a lot of like big bosses and big sort of transforming fights and huge like hour-long sessions of like just hours of combat and stuff, which is it can be great so long as you do it right. 5e I had a lot of problems with because I just couldn't get the balance right of like what monsters to use, and none of the monsters were kind of interesting enough to me. The combats in 5e were over very quickly, which I didn't really enjoy. I like a combat to be a big set piece. If I run a combat, it's got to be interesting and have some kind of point or purpose to it. So I needed to be in a position where I could create my own monsters like very quickly. Not least because I'm the kind of DM who I like to improvise quite a lot as the game progresses, right? I try not to do too much prep because that gets me locked into a sort of that gets me locked into like storytelling mode, and I like to involve players a lot more in that kind of game. So I needed the ability to be able to create any kind of combat in seconds basically, and I needed those monsters to be balanced enough that I could get a rough idea of what the fight was going to be like and how long it might last for, and which player it was going to be particularly interesting or sort of difficult for. So I needed a set of statistics, basically, like a simple table where I could just run down and get basic numbers for that particular monster at that particular level. I needed to know what the hit points should be and what the attack bonus should be and how much damage that monster should be doing sort of roughly every round, that kind of thing. And from that I would be able to just push out a brand new combat without having to kind of leaf through the monster manual and find the right things at the right CR level and all of that. So that sort of led me to create this basic sort of table full of statistics that I could easily just kind of like okay, I need a monster that is going to be a roughly sort of equivalent challenge for a 7th level player, right? And okay, cool, here we go. I've got some stats here for that. You know, it's a 7th level creature. I'll give it 16 AC. It should have 68 hit points. Should attack with a +5. Blah 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 blah. And that was very sort of useful. In fact, that's been incredibly useful. Like I don't use the monster manual stats now for anything ever. I just use these. But figuring these out was difficult at the start. So the first thing that I sort of wanted really was I want one monster to equal 1 player of same level. Good, you know, so that's a good starting point. We know, okay, right, in a fight, a monster should equal a player. Here we go, right? Then after that we go, well, okay, well, how long should that fight last for, right? If it's 1 player and 1 monster, how long do we want that fight to go on for? Like, should it be 3 rounds? Should it be 4? Should it be 5? You know, until like one of them is dead or near death, right? So 4 rounds I opted for, like 4 rounds to live, die. 4 rounds I think is a good length for a combat. You know, you've got a couple of rounds for players to get very confident about and sort of get a very good feeling for. 3 is kind of a turning point for one side or the other, and then 4th is like you know, the climax or the time where it all goes wrong. So that was sort of like the basic starting off point. But then it's like, so how do numbers? So once we got this starting point, it was I had to find out a way of, well, okay, well, how do I get like hit points and stuff from this? You know, how do I know how many hits a monster should have before it dies? I struggled for a while with that until I came across a site that had done all the hard work for me in that kind of respects. Fantastic sites, super useful resource called Song of the Blade, who had already done most of this, like sort of the theory behind this for me, which was just, you know, that they'd really thought through a lot of this and sort of accounted for a lot of things that even I hadn't considered at that particular time. So Song of the Blade went for, they base all of their math on the progression of the fighter class, which I believe they cover down here, right? Oh, thank you for the follow, Pacrat47. So they base all of their stuff on the fighter progression, which I thought is sort of that's a very good way. You know, you've got a good trajectory of knowing how much damage and how many hit points a player of that class is going to have roughly for sort of levels 1 to 20. So this was basically like this paragraph here. I lifted this almost like 1 for 1 right at the start when I was sort of iterating on it, because it's a very good basis, not least because the fighter can kick out so much damage. I still come from 4th edition where I think that the fighters are just sort of controllers, or sort of, you know, they're there to get in the way of monsters, and they're really not. They do so much damage. In my game, I always underestimate my great sword wielding fighter. It's just like every round, you know, it's like, okay, here it's 30 points, 40 points, you know, when he can hit. So basically, for the monster stats, most of the hard work at the start was done by Song of the Blade, which was very kind of them. From that, I did a few modifications, basically. So if we compare that table to... here we go. So I took these stats, and then what I did was I compared them to the adult red dragon, I think it was, or is it the ancient red dragon? Whichever one is the CR sort of 2030 one. So I compared the stats to that monster and tried to get the trajectory, the sort of math formula, so it would hit roughly that region for like defenses and saving throws and sort of attack bonuses. So there was some massaging of these stats afterwards. I think if we look at, in fact, if we look at the Monster Maker code, let me have a find of it here. We'll actually find the exact formula that I use, which is going to be of interest to absolutely no one, but I'm in the thing now. So, perfect. Okay. So this is basically the math that I use to generate what the values should be roughly at any particular level. So for those of you who, again, you know, aren't sort of familiar, I write most of my supplements in HTML because then I can use CSS to style it easily, and more importantly, I can use JavaScript to automate a huge number of useful features for me, like automatically creating monster blocks and tables and aligning everything correctly and putting in footers and all of that junk, which is really useful to me. So this here is sort of the math that generates this table. In fact, like if I change some of these numbers and then kind of rebuild this document here, it will automatically update those numbers, and it will save me a huge number of work, like elsewhere in the document as well. You know, anywhere it references those stats, it will fold them through and update them. So to answer the question, how did I come up with the Monster Maker stats? I tried to copy basically 4th edition D&D as much as I could. Then I found a website that had done a lot of the legwork for me in sort of getting those sort of baseline stats. And then I kind of tweaked the formula a little bit to match the adult dragon stat lines. I used those as kind of like the pinnacle base. And then once I had that from then was very easy to then start piling on the extra sort of monster rolls and elites and solos. Like after that, it all kind of fell into place very easily and very naturally, which I was quite happy about. So hopefully that answers your question, Coldmoss. Thank you for asking. Backrat 47, I know this is a little off topic, but do you have plans for a print version of Darker Dungeons Monster Maker? You should, because your aesthetic is dope. Thank you very much. I do intend at some point to release a sort of hardcover copy of this stuff. That would be really cool for me. I haven't done this yet because I'm still I want to get the text, well, for two reasons really. One, I want to get the text finished, and I'm always sort of tweaking the rules a little bit. So I think it was is it like a Shigeru Miyamoto saying, I think, you know, a bad game is bad forever, right? I want to make sure that the document is good and I'm happy with it before I sort of start printing it. And secondly, I also don't know how to go about printing stuff. So that's something I kind of need to look into in the future. I think like drive-through RPG might be a good avenue for that. I think I considered DM Guild at one point, but I hate their sort of creator restrictions. Like I find it a very, very controlling program. I'm kind of surprised so many people write stuff for it. But that's a whole separate topic for another time. So yes, one day, hopefully not too far. I think Monster Maker is kind of near completion, and Darker Dungeons hopefully not too much longer after that. Thank you for asking. Alexander the Dead, the aesthetic is what drew me in the first time I saw the PDF. Oh, thank you. I did spend a lot of time kind of trying to get the documents looking nice. I think if we look at the originals, where are we? So here we go. So if we look at the archives here, originally it started off, I was just using sort of like placeholder art and very much emulating the raw 5e styles in a very sort of quick and loose way, the same kind of table structures and plain backgrounds and all of that kind of stuff. And over time, it's slowly evolved to kind of a look that I like. I remember actually 1.6 was a terrible one. So this was, I think, the one where I got rid of the darkest dungeon artwork because, you know, it's not my art, and I didn't want to keep using that forever. And then I've like, just while I'm kind of figuring things out, this was what it looked like for one version, until I think it must have been 1.7 afterwards. I spent, I think, like a week just kind of trying to figure out a brand new look that I could sort of easily reuse and stuff. So it is nice to hear that other people enjoy that. So thank you. Was this the first question asked? Yep, I've only asked one so far. I'm hoping to get through 6 if I don't keep ranting like I usually do. When you're ready to take my money. If only. Yeah, one day this will be in print, and then I can retire to an island and never play Dungeons and Dragons again. I think that's the point. Cool. Okay, so let's see what question number 2 is, shall we? When designing rules, do you follow some guidelines, and if so, what are they? And that's from Twigwolf 4. So this is something I think a lot about. So designing rules is always difficult because you want to kind of try, you want to, how do I answer this? Well, let's start off with my guidelines, or sort of my process first, right? So when I'm designing a new thing, and in fact, actually what we'll do, here's a little preview of what I'm working on for the next version of Darker Dungeons, which is a whole chapter on light and how to manage it and how to do that, hopefully in a fun way that doesn't involve counting distances, because that is tedious work to me. So what I do first and foremost is think about story. So everything that I try and write is to help create story material, right? You know, if I put in inventory restrictions, that isn't to cripple your character, that is to create interesting story moments or story beats, right? You know, having a party that now has to decide about what they're going to carry into the dungeon, and if they don't take enough or they didn't take the right thing, you know, how are they going to get across this? The intent of all of these rules, inventory, stress, survival conditions, it's all to help foster storytelling material between players and the DM. So that is really my first thought. Like, what kind of stories is this gonna? Are these rules gonna help me tell? So with light, for instance, what is the story? Dark should be scary. Players need to decide what light they carry. Little kind of tiny indiscreet sort of story beats like that, right? You know, once you put in light mechanics, now you can build stuff around that theme. You know, now I can create monsters that focus on players who are carrying light sources, and what happens if they drop that light source, and now for a round, like, everyone is in darkness, or to, you know, they suddenly are in a cavern or in a let's say a boss arena, right? And I know on the third round the boss is going to extinguish all the torches, and now everyone again is going to sort of be like hidden in darkness, and like, how do they react to that? What are the players going to do to kind of get out of that situation? It's really to help put players in unforeseen situations, because for me the excitement of the game is seeing what players are going to do with like the little arena, or you know, the little story framework that I've kind of put together, and seeing how they're going to outthink me, because they always do. So once I've thought about the kind of story beats that I want to hit, or the kind of like the particular tone that I'm looking for in my game, then I want to see, has this been done elsewhere? Has anyone else done this? Now, so let's go for so let's take the active initiative system as an example for this one. Now, what I wanted, you know, the story that I wanted was for players to be able to sort of work together and create like cool little character moments that I felt the default initiative system couldn't do, because players are like kind of, you know, waiting for their turn, and if I have to sit around just waiting for my time, well, I can't easily chain my attack with my fighter's attack, right, to kind of get like a cool flanking thing or whatever. So active initiative, what is the story? I want to get players kind of having cool character combo moves, that kind of thing. Has anyone else done this? So for this, I looked at other alternative initiative systems, and one that caught my eye was, just out of interest, was Greyhawk Initiative, I believe it's called. For those of you who aren't familiar with Greyhawk Initiative, you roll initiative at the start of every round, and you decide then and there what you're going to do, and that affects like the dice that you roll to get your initiative ranking for that round. And that was kind of interesting to me. I thought, oh, okay, all right, so it's going to put players in a position where they have to nominate what they're going to do first, rather than just kind of like wait until it's their turn and then decide, and that could come up with like little interesting story beats. But that very quickly led me to, is it tedious work? Rolling initiative every round for 5 players and the DM and all their monsters is tedious work. In my opinion, if you enjoy that in your game, you know, that's fine. You play it however you like. But that to me does not tell an interesting story. You know, all that does is slow the pace of the game down. And I was not interested in doing that at all. So I very quickly dropped the idea of Greyhawk Initiative and went for something that is, you know, the modern sort of an active initiative system, which is a lot more sort of free form and doesn't involve any additional dice rolls. Because if it is, get rid of it. Now, one example, actually, if we look back, so one of the earliest additions to Darker Dungeons was stress, and that was a very core theme, especially in the earlier editions, where it was very central to the core book. You know, everything kind of hinged around stress before I made it modular and took it apart. If we look at, so survival conditions here worked by applying modifiers to your stress bonus that you then had to calculate on the fly, and it sounded great to me, and sort of I had fun with it on like my initial sort of play tests, but very quickly it became tedious to do. Like, it was great, fantastic to do online. Like, Roll20 can automate all that kind of calculation work and do it for you free of cost, which was, then it was kind of fun. But to do it at the table was tedious work for everyone. So that is an example of a kind of rule set that's kind of grown throughout and been revised and refactored to focus on rule 3, because if it's tedious at all, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. It's definitely not going to work for my players. It's not going to work for me because I like a fast game, and so I had to refactor it into the sort of stress agnostic level system that it is now. And it still needs a slight bit of work as well. I think it can be refined further. But in terms of guidelines, actually a fourth one is, what do they call it? KISS, right? Keep it simple. So this is the fourth. Anytime I come up with a system, I immediately overcomplicate things, because that's what I do. And then I have to look at ways to kind of cut it down and pare it, so that players don't have to keep flicking back to kind of revise rules or see like, how does this little edge case work, right? Many times I have considered doing sort of more complicated things with weapons. Like I've had a few like weapon types, and you know, maybe on a crit, you know, this kind of weapon will do this effect, and this one will do this, and etc. etc. But that ended up becoming a very complicated system that didn't really add enough to the story that I really wanted it to. So these are kind of the 4 factors that I'm always trying to keep in mind. You know, what is the story that I want to tell with this? Has anyone already done it? And if so, what is right or wrong with what they've done? 3, is this fun and tedious? Fun or tedious? And finally, revise and keep it as simple and straightforward as possible. And that's slightly incongruous, I'm aware, with the number of pages that I write to kind of expand and sort of define all of this stuff, right? You know, Darker Dungeons is like 120 pages of rules, which is not necessarily simple, but a lot of this is kind of trying to cover specific edge cases or factoring in examples and things, stuff that will help the DM answer any or adjudicate at the table better when situations come up. So hopefully that answers your question as to what guidelines I sort of follow. Yeah, I think those are sort of the 4 that I generally keep in mind whenever I'm writing stuff, and they're a big factor, hopefully, like in the light stuff when that gets finished. Alexander the Dead, speaking of dark, love the dark vision to low light change. Yeah, I like the fact that everyone has dark vision basically in 5e is phenomenal to me. Like, there are so many odd decisions in this game that just turn off features, right? You know, why does everyone have dark vision? It's basically, I think, because the authors don't want players to worry about light. So rather than coming up with an interesting way to manage light in their games, they've just given everyone dark vision, which is phenomenal to me, and it does not tell a story. It does not help me advance a particular tone in my game, right? If I'm going into dungeons and I want it to be dark, oh, you can't in 5th edition. Like, you just can't. Everyone's got dark vision. So just give up is basically what that says. So when I was writing Darker Dungeons, that was one of the very core things that I kind of wanted to get back to, sort of that primal fear of the dark, right? The same as well, kind of like for this light spell as well. Like, I mean, light is another thing that they put in the game to tell you basically don't worry about light because it's a waste of time. It's just a baffling design choice that hopefully in this edition, once I've finished the light chapter, will sort of complete the set and finally give the like sort of, this for me is like a linchpin rule set for Darker Dungeons, and hopefully that will sort of complete it. I miss 2nd edition, low light and infravision. See, yeah, I'm always in 2 minds about those. Like, I thought they were fun from a flavor perspective, but from my, in fairness, very limited experience with 2nd edition, most of which I think comes from Baldur's Gate, I remember it being a bit more tedious to have so many different forms of like vision. So I'm kind of glad they pared it down a little bit. I just wish they hadn't just pared it down to dark vision and everyone's got it. It's like how Dark Sun got rid of metal. Oh yeah, exactly. Like yeah, Packrat 47. I think I've only played 4 games in Dark Sun in my life and loved every single one of them. It's such a fun setting with so much flavor, and just like removing, like you say, removing metal is just one major kind of thing, and it doesn't really affect the rules, right? When we were playing 4th edition, it would just be, well, everyone's got a longsword, but it's not really a longsword. It's like a bone or a chitin sword or whatever. But that was still so cool, and there was so much flavor kind of baked into that. You know, it told a story. It wasn't tedious work at all, because you didn't have to do anything complicated about like just homebrewing the same stats and just reflavoring them as something else. And it was super simple, like a tiny change that thematically revamps your game. And it was like, oh, it's like a huge inspiration for me, like going forward. I always thought Greyhawk initiative slow combat to a halt. Exactly, like anything like that in a game, I run far and far away from. Like I don't really have the time in what, like a 3-4 hour game to burn on just waiting to on trying to see who goes first. You know, it's like that is not an interesting story to me. You know, it's just a roadblock for players. When a combat drags on for 2 hours, it's bleh. Yeah, I definitely agree. Like, I love combat. I'm a huge combat fan, and I do have a tendency to run long combats, especially when I do like a big boss monster, right? I have had boss monsters that have easily gone like 2 hours, right? You know, it's like, it's because it's a climactic fight, and you've got your big boss, and then suddenly, you know, they're kind of fighting it, and they get it down to like 2/3 hit points, and then it kind of shatters the ground, and kind of the volcano erupts, right? When you're running long combats, you have to find ways to keep it exciting. You need to keep that energy up for the game and for the group, right? And that means stopping players getting bored or too comfortable. So that was a large part of sort of why, if we look at my solo rules for Monster Maker, there we go. So the main incentive for the sort of phase transition rules that the solo monsters have is to keep things changing in a long combat situation. You know, I know that when I run a solo, I've got at least 2 opportunities to completely change what is happening in this battle, which can really throw players off. Like you know, they're kind of expecting that this spell that they've put on it is just going to last forever, and they've got it locked down, and then suddenly, you know, it grows an extra size, and it smashes the side of the cavern, and the cavern wall falls through, and everyone sort of plummets down into a new kind of arena with a new layout and stuff. That stuff I love so much, from all of my sort of video game time. Kobold press weapon maneuvers in the Midgard Hero's Handbook. They are things you can do if you are proficient in the weapon. Oh, interesting. Yeah, that, I mean, it sounded like something that someone else has done before. I do need to read more of the Kobold press stuff, actually, because I think I've only read Tome of Beasts of theirs, and that, like, although I don't really enjoy how 5th edition monsters are made, they had some really cool ones in that that I was very tempted to kind of draft into my game at one point. What is really great about 5th edition is it is fully modular. Definitely agree with that. So I have a lot of complicated feelings about 5th edition because there's a lot of stuff that is very oddly designed about it, but it's so easy to just plug and play new rules into this that you just couldn't do with 4th edition. You know, everyone, you look at Unearthed Arcana or any of the sort of D&D subreddits, there's like you can't move for brand new classes and subclasses or sort of races and sub-races that people are just like throwing out because it's so easy to create those things now. Whereas in 4th edition, you just like creating a class was, I mean, that was never going to happen because you had to create powers and like special paragon features and so much work that no one's going to sit down and have the time to do. So 5th edition is beautiful from a modular perspective, and it's something I've really tried to focus on with the Darker Dungeons rules. You know, embracing that you don't have to have the whole rule set, you can just pick and mix the bits that you want into your particular campaign or particular adventure. So perfect. Okay, so Packrat 47. Anyway, love your work. Be following your stuff. Gotta go. Peace. Thank you for your questions. Have a good night. Cool. Okay. Sorry. So rambling. Right. Question 3 is. Question 3, any progress on Artifactory? Specifically, I was wondering if you had intentions to revamp the lackluster system Wizards gave us for crafting. And that's Alexander the Dead. Yeah, there you go. Don't say I don't give anything back to the community. So, we'll just launch straight into that, shall we? Artifactory, for those of you who aren't familiar with that, and why would you be? Nothing's kind of been officially released for that, but Artifactory is a magic item supplement that I've had in the back of my mind for a very long time, and it's kind of been pushed back and back because of sort of the new changes to Monster Maker and the web apps and all of this stuff that's kind of gotten in the way. So for Artifactory, I think one piece has been properly completed, and that was sort of socketed gear, right? These were rules that I took from Diablo 2. Or sort of, I took, not the rules, obviously, but I took huge inspiration from like Diablo 2 and World of Warcraft, sort of the Burning Legion, Burning Crusade kind of time frame, because I love the idea of players upgrading their own sort of weapons, right? Rather than just, oh, here's the loot that you got at the end of the boss. You know, I love the idea of them taking a thing and growing it over time, right? You know, finding someone who can add that, you know, precious second socket to my, you know, +1 longsword. Because that kind of stuff helps me tell a story. I just realized I've been on the wrong thing for that entire time. Okay, right. Start again. Here's the socketed gear sort of PDF that I pushed out a while ago. And why did I sort of write these rules, and what am I trying to do with Artifactory? I'm trying to tell a story. I'm trying to help create like fun little moments that are player focused, because that's sort of the stuff I like. I like to help players create little quests of their own. And socketed gear is a brilliant one for that, because once you put that in your world, players want to socket their gear, and they want to find people who can socket their gear, and they want to find gemstones to socket into their gear. And you don't have to do any work around this. That's basically a story and an adventure written for you. You know, you just have to tell them, oh no, the blacksmith who can do the second level socket in your war hammer, oh, he's over here in this city. He's in like the dwarven city, but that's all the way over here. Oh, you want someone to put a socket in your sword? Ah, he's all the way in the other direction, mate. He's in the town like that you passed a while ago. Which one are you going to go for, right? Because time's an issue. Oh, and you're going to need a gemstone? Oh, the gemstones, you get those from, like, dragon hearts. Are you strong enough to fight a dragon? Oh, you're not? Well, you might need to find a way to get some power so you can kill that dragon, so you can get the heart, so you can upgrade your gear. You know, that kind of just natural storytelling that is player-driven, it's my favourite thing. In the world, like you know, that's I used to run D&D games with sort of big stories and big like ongoing threads and sort of, you know, complicated scenarios where NPCs are trying to do their own little thing in the backgrounds and sort of out of sight and whatever. And actually, players don't really give a crap about half of that all the time because they don't see it, and when they do see it, they assume they're being railroaded. So actually, coming up with little systems like this has let me plan pretty much nothing for my campaigns now, because players will tell me what they want, and I will write an adventure that will now incorporate that in some fashion. But coming back to Artifactory, oh yeah, I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Thank you. In fact, actually, I did some other. I'm surprised. I thought I had a fuller one here. Oh, that's right. So yeah, jewels as well. You know, jewels actually were definitely taken from Diablo. So trying to come up with, again, you know, this is an example of like rule 4 in action, actually rule 2 in action, 2 and 4. Wanted a system where you could just add jewels into your thing, but I didn't want another tier that would move, like, be even more complicated than the gemstones. You know, this is already a bit of reference that players have to kind of be aware of. So I took gemstones and just let you bundle a bunch of them into a special jewel enclosure, and that kept it simple enough to kind of only require one page specifically for like a jewels expansion, which was nice. But so for Artifactory, what am I planning on? 1, socketed gear. That one's nearly complete. I think I just need to finish rune words, and that one still needs a bit more thinking on. I love the idea of a rune word system, and then that also combines with like recipes that, you know, maybe players can go out and find to learn a bit more about the ancient language that the rune words are written in, to finally plug into their gear and whatever. But it's, you know, I need to still work on that too. Recipes. So an important thing for crafting is getting recipes or blueprints to know or learn how to craft the sort of things that you want to do. So I want a little system here where to craft something, you need to acquire the blueprints, whether you buy them or sort of find them as like a special kind of hidden thing from like a boss's library or something, and then you can add that to like your blueprint book, and then maybe you could sell that book right to someone else who kind of wants those blueprints, or use them to craft finally that new gem harness that you need to get your socketed sword up to level 3 and all that stuff. 3 charged items. So I briefly dug into this last week, I think, but if we look at, I should really keep better track of these things. There was a gemstone somewhere. Anyway, okay, so charged items are also another thing that I want to add in. So there was a ring of healing surge that I released as an example. Oh, that someone's already put on D&D Beyond. Perfect, cool. That is also the same. Here we go. Okay, finally. I need to organize my stuff much better. So this is an example of something else I want to sort of focus on. Little magic items that have a sort of charge system that players can customize and choose what effect happens when, based on how much charge they want to burn. It's not just like a power boost. It does something interesting with like little riders and that kind of stuff. And it also has like little ways to upgrade that sort of item as well. That kind of stuff I enjoy as well, because it helps players tell stories, and importantly gives them more goals, right? If I have the Ring of Healing Surge, I know that I can upgrade the capacity of this, or I can upgrade the power, but I've only got the right gem shards to upgrade one of these things, and which one does the party choose? That kind of stuff. Huge fan of those things. Charged items. Gun casters / caster gun. So I was watching an anime called Outlaw Star a while ago, which I saw years and years and years ago when I was a kid. And it has a gun that shoots magic, and it is the coolest thing in the world. And I want to create, I want players to be able to make those. Whether that's only a sort of artificer kind of item, I'm still unsure about. I'm also still kind of working on the mechanics around that and like which direction I go down. Let me see if I have a rough draft of it somewhere. Guncaster. So caster guns. Okay, here we go. So caster guns, like I'm not very far at all. This is still in the very loose setting. Gun mages, yeah, yeah, exactly. Demon Ralph. Gun mages, super cool. So I'm still very much in the early stages with this. There are a few things that I really want to focus on, which are, again, what story is coming out of this. And I want the gun itself to be a really cool thing that is not just about mechanics, right? I'm not really, for all the rules that I write, I'm not actually a mechanics kind of interested DM, right? I need the rules to tell stories, but the stories are the thing that I'm interested in. So I need rules to help you create a caster gun. And part of that is going to be like, okay, well, what frame does it have? Have you got like a pistol or, a sort of rifle, or a blunderbuss, or, I need to Aquabus or whatever. I forget the medieval sort of terminology for this. But also, like, what kind of stone is at the heart of your caster gun, and how much power is that going to confer, and how much is that going to allow you to cast shells, and importantly, what is the name of your gun, because no caster gun should be without a name. This has to be really cool, and I think the flavor of it is really going to be just the act of firing a caster gun, right? I want it to be really cool so that when you're choosing to fire that fireball shell, right, that you load it into your gun and you spin the cylinder and then you charge it and you know, fire it at that sort of crowd of goblins or orcs or whatever. I want that to be so cool because it's called a caster gun and it has to be the coolest thing ever. So this is going to be hopefully a large part of Artifactory at some point. For a while, I was dabbling about making a guncaster class. I'm still umming and ahhing about that. But that might be a bit too much work. I know that a lot of people out there are pushing out classes and doing a lot of like involved work on that stuff, and that's not really an area of mine. So potentially, you know, there could be like a subclass maybe for fighter or artificer, but it might just be the case that a caster gun is like a really cool crossbow that's hard to get and is kind of like spirit linked to a character it's crafted for, right? Something like that, soulbound or whatever the Warcraft terminology would be. So that's Guncasters and caster guns. What else was there? Arcane Dust. That's just a kind of way of like turning gemstones and sort of like lame magic gear into sort of dust that you use to create these magic items, or sort of potentially use as a generic component for casting spells, right? It's sort of like an artificer craft. Last but not least, some actual crafting rules, because the Wizards ones are really, really, really boring, and I don't care about them because it's spending gold and putting in a bit of time, and that does not tell me a story. So what I want to do with this is tie it very much into the sort of recipes and blueprints system that I want to incorporate, where every magic item has like sort of 1 or 2, or depending on the thing, you know, maybe like 3 named sort of components. And this could be like a really common thing, like a sort of, you know, kobold scale, or you know, more complicated stuff like dragon heart, or you know, sort of gelatinous ooze, or something like that. Some kind of named component that, in a very Monster Hunter way, you can harvest from monsters and use them to, you know, you could sell them to people, or, you know, oh, I want to craft this thing, but I need to get the dragon heart, and the only dragon is the one in the mountains, and again, he's way above our level. So is there a way that we can get the heart from him? Or, you know, like little stories like that are just all about the, you know, fun factor for me. So there was, I believe, someone who wrote a great little supplement about crafting components from 5e monsters, I think. Utilizing monster parts, creature loot, Or was it creature loot? Someone wrote a... this might be the one, actually, yes. So something very in this kind of space where this has things that you can harvest and scavenge from monsters, and that might be a really cool resource to dip into or take inspiration from, right? I don't think I necessarily need to go into this level of detail. You know, it might simply be enough to say that you just need a common component from this type of race or something like that. I need to figure out how to keep it simple. But I do really like that kind of monster hunter going out into the world to get the material you need to craft the gear that you need to socket the gemstone that you've got in to boost the power to kill the demon that's trying to invade your worlds, right? You know, it's like it's just story beat after story beat after story beat, and it's just natural, right? Would you be able to substitute other named components but have a weaker or weird side effect? Exactly, yeah. So I'm, from the sort of the many thoughts I have about this kind of thing, I think that would be a very cool variant, I think. My brain is telling me to just keep it simple and go with sort of tiers. So, you know, you have common components and uncommon and sort of rare and legendary, you know, go with that whole sort of WoW tiered system. But maybe some things need specific names, and if you can't get that, but you have to just go with go with the off-brand version, right? Oh, I've got a blue dragon scale, not a red dragon scale. What does that do? Perhaps you have to like roll on a table that has a random modifier to that kind of to that ability. But yeah, so these I think are these are like the 5 pillars of what I'm hoping will make it into Artifactory at some point. I'll be very interested. I haven't read the Artificer class for a while, so in a way it would be nice to kind of link this in almost with the Artificer class when it's kind of released. Perhaps like caster guns will be a large part of that. You know, some of these kind of these magical items can only be crafted by an Artificer, maybe, and that will give that class a kind of natural hook into the world. But we'll kind of see where that goes. You know, I'm very it's very early days for Artifactory still, unfortunately. So hopefully, once Monster Maker is near finished and Darker Dungeons is closer to a sort of finished state, I can get back to focusing on this stuff because it's rooting around in here. So I hope that answers your question, Alexander the Dead. Again, sorry, ranting quite a lot. So we'll move on to question 4. As a DM, how do you acclimate players to keeping track of so many systems at once? And that's from Screwloose. Now, this is a very common thing to be afraid of, because nothing is more... Few things are more tedious in a game than having to pause everything to answer another question for the 5th time about like how to have fun in this game, right? So I try to keep everything simple. that's difficult to do when you have 120 pages of sort of optional rules, right? So the approach I take now, especially because there is so much, and in fact it's one I've recommended for a long time with Darker Dungeons, is never run the whole thing unless you and your players are 100% on board with all of the rules in it. I recommend you use, especially, it also depends on the experience level of your players. I would say if you are running for a brand new set of players, I wouldn't run any of these. I would just use raw 5th edition, unless, you know, as an exception, I would probably use the active defense and active initiative rules, with sort of the taking action skill set as well. These don't really change raw 5th edition that much. They just streamline a few things for you and don't require any extra work or investment on new players. After that, it very much depends on what you want your story to focus on. Most of these actually don't crop up that often. Wounds and injuries, for instance, you don't really need to go into that at the start of a game. You only really need to talk about that when it happens. The same with death and resurrection. Same with disease. Disease is, like, in fact, it's probably one of the chapters that I have used the least, because it just crops up very infrequently in my games. But it's always there for, like, when I want to dip into it. Thank you for sorry to interrupt. Thank you for your questions, Alexander the Great. Good luck with your game. Thanks for stopping by. I hope it goes great. So when I am starting a new game or a new campaign, especially when I'm doing my session 0, I will have a chat with the players, talk about what I am intending to crop up in this game or in this campaign, and I'll usually set out a few basic things. So I might say I want survival conditions. I want inventory management. I want burnout. And I also want long rests to be a week. This one, actually, I don't really... I don't accept no one. Now, this is just how I run my games. But I usually set out the main things I expect to crop up in this game. It's like, oh, okay, maybe I'm running a Lovecraftian one, and it's like, okay, I want stress to crop up as well. So I'll have my session 0 with my players. I'll talk about some of the rules that I want to introduce to the game. And if they're not familiar with those, we'll have a little chat about them. I'll give them the very overall gist of what happens and how they're sort of used during the game. And then if any of them veto those rules, they don't get used. If someone says, I don't really enjoy survival management, I find it a bit tedious, it's going to be a real drag for me. If I can't really think of a way to convince them that they should try it, or it might be fun, I just don't use it, right? It's not a core feature of my game. But let's say for stress, for instance, the players veto stress and decide they don't want to use it. Okay, we don't use stress. But what I might do is, much later on, there is a love a sort of Far Realm themed adventure. Maybe the players are sort of dipping into an old the ruins of sort of like Dagon, right? You know, some aberrant Far Realmian elder god who's like got a cult growing. For that particular adventure, I might use the stress rules while those players are inside that dungeon. I just did this in my previous, in my last week's game, sort of the last 2 weeks for that. My players, we don't use the burnout rules at the moment. But what they did do was sort of invade this sort of ancient reliquary of an anti-magic spell faction, basically. Anti-magic zones. So for that particular adventure and for those 2 weeks, while they were sort of exploring that space and fighting mechanical creatures and modrons and whatever, we had the spell burnout rules. And that, I find, is a very sort of smooth way of introducing rules that players might at first be afraid of, because, you know, burnout can, it looks scary at first. You know, if you're a spellcaster and I'm doing this and it triggers on my cantrips and, oh no, I'm never going to be able to cast spells and this is really going to hurt me, and you know, fear, which is perfectly legitimate. You know, a lot of these rules do look painful, but actually, if you just introduce it as like a small theme in one particular adventure at some point, actually players kind of get to see it in action without having to shoulder it for an entire campaign, right? And that's one of the tricks that I sort of use to introduce rules occasionally on a sort of temporary basis during a campaign. But otherwise, it mostly comes down to agreeing up front with players which rules you're going to use and introducing them slowly over, like, I would say, like the first 2 or 3 games you play with them, right? You know, don't hit them straight up with, you know, a huge long journey and survival conditions as part of that. And at the same time, now you're going to also do a long rest for a week, right? You know, you stagger it a little bit. So it's like maybe the first few games, they're just sort of doing a very close adventure that doesn't require you to use the journey rules. You can slowly draft those in the next session or the one after that. And then you just sort of stagger that rule set rather than just like, boom, learn new rules. And that, in my limited experience, has worked to a comfortable degree. So hopefully that answers your question. Thanks for asking. Thank you for asking it, Screwloose. Let's see what question 4 is. It's not that one because we've asked that. Question 5. What's your end goal with the Darker Dungeons supplement? Do you see it growing indefinitely? Othesimo. Good question. So Darker Dungeons has been going on for a while now, actually, which is quite scary when I think about it. More than a year now, certainly. So initially, I wrote this just as a sort of small combination of little rules and things that I wanted to just formalize and see if anyone else would make use of. And over time, more and more stuff has kind of crept into this, and this has kind of become my default bin almost for all of my rules that I write. I just kind of throw stuff. I don't throw stuff in here, but a lot of mechanics that I write now naturally kind of fit in with a sort of Darker Dungeon aesthetic, because that tends to be my style as a DM anyway. So there are a few things that are definitely lacking from Darker Dungeons, I think. The main things, so what is lacking from Darker Dungeons? Light mechanics. These are this is a big one that I'm in the stage of kind of doing the first proper draft of at the moment. Light is a really important part of coming up with a sort of darkest dungeon aesthetic, right? And it has so many sort of natural hooks as well, light mechanics and how they affect stress, for instance. That is like the next sort of major expansion, I think, for Darker Dungeons. As part or as a follow-on to that as well, it really needs, I think, just a bit of clarity around helpers and henchmen. Especially like, might need some torchbearers now, because light is going to be a sort of more impactful feature. So having someone to carry that torch is going to be very useful. After that, there was one. I was dabbling at some point with using rules to support the Silver Standard, but I'm not sure whether that's really that might not be a Darker Dungeons kind of thing. That might actually just be better pulled out to a kind of separate system. And after that, it really needs, I think, a small sort of adventure, almost like a starting hub, right? So, like I did in Monster Maker, I wrote a small adventure to demonstrate some of the sort of rules in action with this. So if we look down here at the Court of Bones, for instance, 36. This is a small adventure I wrote using a sort of edited map from Dyson Logos that provides an example of like how to use the monster creation rules to build a small adventure and sort of like add little traps and that kind of thing. Or in how to run an elite and some minions, and how to do summoning, and how to run a solo that has 3 distinct phases and kind of what happens during those, and how to kind of build on that to expand your own campaign, that kind of thing. So really, I think a similar kind of feature for Darker Dungeons on that same aspect would be really useful, like a small hub perhaps of like a basic town that serves as an example of how to create or populate a place with mentors, and then maybe has like around that like 3 adventure sites that provide an example of how to use the journey rules, and how to stock a small dungeon with active XP so that you get to see these in action. Whether that is a part of Darker Dungeons or perhaps a follow-on supplement is something I'm considering. Maybe it doesn't need to be part of the rules. It can be pulled out into a separate sort of larger supplement that over time can be expanded as well. But it could well be that these 2 things are the main outstanding issues, or the main sort of missing culprits from Darker Dungeons. There are a few things I want to revise as well. There are some variants for dangerous magic and stress that I kind of want to update and sort of refine a tiny bit. some clarity on like how to use fate points or what fate points add to your game, that kind of thing. And after that, hopefully, that will be enough. But if there is anything that you think might be missing from Darker Dungeons, or something that you have looked through or looked for and found doesn't make sense or would be a nice expansion, I'm certainly open to suggestions of stuff that could be useful in a document like this. Isomov, does that mean no more dark vision? Quite the opposite. So dark vision I nerfed in 1.6, I believe, here. So a lot of races I kind of replaced dark vision with low light vision that had sort of less potent effects, because dark vision is crazy. So what I'm aiming for with the light mechanic is now, instead of worrying about distance, we just apply a flat lighting level to like the entire room or dungeon or kind of its space of interest, right? So now we can just say, oh, this place, this entire sort of dungeon, there's like a tiny bit of light filtering through. It's dark in this dungeon. And dark vision works in that space. You know, if you have dark vision and it's dark light, you can still see, albeit in sort of black and white, right? If it's darkest, however, you know, like if we're in a space where there's absolutely no light, you know, it's like a sealed room or whatever, there's nothing for your dark vision eyes, right, to kind of magnify. I'm assuming it works a bit like cat's eyes, right? So in this particular, at this level of light, even dark vision has no benefit, right? There's nothing for it to amplify. So if you're descending into a dungeon that is deep underground with absolutely no light, you'll need to take more light sources, right? You'll need to take like one torch just to get some light for your dark vision to work. And then maybe you'll need to carry a lantern as well to kind of bump that up another 2 levels to get some bright light in this space. So that should keep dark vision, or keep some utility of dark vision and sort of low light vision here in these tiers. But I definitely want to, for me it's almost necessary to keep one layer of light source, or one layer of light that even dark vision has no benefit for, right? That's when like the warlock, what's the warlock ability, like devil's sight or demon sight or something of that tier, you know, when sort of magical effects like come in, you know, they're the only things that can even pierce like this zone of no light kind of thing. And hopefully that will, yeah, keep everything still slightly useful, but without allowing dark vision to be the kind of overpowered feature that it is right now. So yeah, hopefully once these two are done, I can start to think about wrapping up Darker Dungeons, or at least the first book of Darker Dungeons, and unless I get any more sort of spectacular ideas, and I can kind of work on those over time. And then perhaps after, once those are done, I can start, I think, to start pushing it towards a printable form, which would be really cool. I need to update the art assets and stuff to kind of support it, but hopefully that will probably get it up to, like, I would say 130, 150 pages maybe. Which is, I think, significant enough for a kind of modular rule set expansion. So hopefully that answers your question, Othesmo. Thank you for asking. Question 6, the final question, the final official question for the evening. How is the section on degrees of success supposed to work? And that's from Lone Paladin. So, degrees of success. Now, this is something I added because I played a lot of Fate a few years ago and I love that system. It's got a lot of issues, but its ability to get players negotiating or sort of chatting with the DM really influenced how I ran and how I run a lot of my 5th edition games. You know, I really try to communicate with the players and get them sort of invested more in the story than bare bones mechanics. And degrees of success is a great way to ease players into sort of having those discussions and getting them more involved with the plot. So degrees of success, page 42. So at its base level, a degree of success is anytime you roll the dice and there is a chance of failure, your quality of roll determines 1, whether you succeed or fail, and 2, if you roll really well or you roll really bad, then better things happen to you, or more interestingly, worse things happen to you. So we'll go through these sort of very briefly. So a critical success, you succeed by 10 or more on a skill check or rolled a natural 20 on an attack. So you achieve your goal and something else happens in your favor. So let's say I want to incorporate degrees of success, and I want to incorporate critical successes into my game. Now, anytime someone succeeds on an ability roll, or they roll a 20 on their attack roll, the thing that they were trying to achieve happens. So I hit my enemy, I unlock the trap, I find or I spot the incoming sort of enemies, and one extra thing kind of happens in my favor as well, you know. And as the DM, you can decide what that is. You can have a little chat with your player, perhaps, about like what that thing happens, what boon they get. And I added a little random table here as well that sort of, you know, worst case scenario, you can just randomly generate a thing and just deal with whatever the gods decide will happen to that character, right? But what you get for a critical success is your thing, one bonus thing. And this could be anything. This could be, you know, maybe you get some hit points back. If you're using the stress rules, maybe you kind of relieve a bit of stress. Were you feeling exhausted? Maybe you're a bit less exhausted now. You know, did you open up a like a locked chest and you did it really well? Well, maybe, you know, unrelated to that, maybe there's like an extra like 10 gold in there or whatever. That's something, like I say, that you can negotiate with your player about, you know, sort of tell them what you know, they've succeeded, or a lot of the times the player will know that they have had a critical success, and just sort of negotiate with them about what you think that bonus, what an appropriate sort of bonus to that action is. If the player just gets sort of like within the range, you know, sort of like 0 to 9 bonus, they just get the thing that they were trying to do, right? You know, I hit my enemy, I unlock the gate, and nothing sort of extra happens as a part of that. Now, success at a cost. This is my favourite. Sometimes, depending on players, I don't use critical success rolls or rules. And the same with critical failures. This one I always use as a blanket introduction, because it's so much fun. With success at cost, if a player rolls and they fail by 1, 2, or 3, I tell them you can succeed at a cost. And they have to offer me something that is story appropriate to let them turn that failure into a success. Maybe they'll offer me a hit dice. You know, maybe the fighter is so close to hitting that that dragon, but the scales are just slightly too thick. He couldn't penetrate them, but he just overexerts himself a little bit. You know, burning that hit die to pierce through that sort of draconic scale and hit the dragon successfully. You know, perhaps the mage who is trying to cast some kind of spell or charm, or like even the warlock, right, who is trying to hit a beholder with an eldritch blast, right? You know, the one warlock spell, and he's so close. You know, he's almost hitting that beholder. Maybe he wants to just burn a little spell slot to like give that spell just a tiny bit of extra power to hit that target. You know, maybe the thief who is trying to unlock that door before the guards arrive. She's so close to unlocking it. Maybe if she just twists that lockpick and takes a notch of damage to it, you know, making it harder to unlock stuff in future unless she repairs it, she'll sort of twist it and just unjam that final lever. Is that what they're called? Anyway, thief tools damaged. Basically, this this success at a cost thing allows players to talk to me during the game, and it's great. I recommend everyone use these all the time in every game, because it helps your players decide what is really important to them, or helps them tell you what is important to them. You know, is it really important that they hit this dragon, and what are they going to sacrifice to do that? You know, maybe if they failed by, did they fail by 3? Maybe they need to burn 2 hit dice. Maybe hit dice isn't enough. Maybe it's going to destroy that weapon, or shatter it, or, you know, just for them to get in that last hit to use that ability that they were really keen to use. It's a great way for players to feel less bored during the game, right? You know, no one wants to have their turn come up and then roll the die and miss by 1 and that's your turn, right? It's boring. This helps your players stay in the game and it helps tell a story. And this is, again, you know, this drives everything for me. And it helps them tell me the story, which is, again, another sort of brilliant thing. So moving on from success at a cost, we have a simple sort of failure. You know, you failed at an action and something bad happens, right? You know, anytime you roll the dice, or really, like, when you're rolling dice in a game like Dungeons & Dragons, you should only really be doing it if there is a chance of failure, and when it is an interesting failure, right? A lot of DMs, and I have done this myself, because players like to roll dice, and I like to let them roll dice. Will roll for anything, even when they're either guaranteed to succeed or not succeed, whatever the cost. What's the failure? Nothing happens at all. It's not interesting. It doesn't add anything to the story. It just means you're taking up a bit more sort of time. So the failure rule is here so that whenever a player fails on a skill check or an attack, something bad does happen. You know, again, do they take some damage? Do they lose a tool? Do they burn a spell slot? These kind of things. This is a bit more of a sort of punishing. Punishing is the wrong word. This is a more careful style of game. You know, if you use this failure, and more importantly, the critical failure part of the degrees of success chapter, your players will have to very carefully think about whether rolling a dice is a worthwhile action, because anything they roll, or any time they roll, something bad might happen to them, and this can lead to very tense games. I've seen a couple online, especially some run by Emerald Grid, I believe, like many months ago, which are fantastic. Like, if you add these into your game, players can very easily get locked into a sort of failure loop, right? You know, I failed on one thing, and I lost a hit die, and that's going to make it harder for me to keep fighting and keep going and sort of win that back. It's almost like a Monopoly kind of loop, right? You know, one failure, and it's much easier for you to fail in the future. Which depends on your game, and depends on your dungeon master, and depends on your players. You know, some people like that risk in their campaign, and like that constant threat. Like, if I'm rolling a dice, am I going to get, you know, screwed over here? But some people don't. And if they're not, or if you're not, I would advise you to not use critical failure and failure, or critical success. I would 100% recommend you stick with success at a cost. This is, you know, success at a cost, weak long rests, active defense, active initiative, and open skills. These are the rules that I use, whatever the game. This is now my default way of running 5th edition, and everything else I just kind of draft in, depending on the particular game. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of advice or guidance on how to use degrees of success, and how to kind of break that chapter up depending on your game style or your sort of players. I may actually, depending on what I can do for the next version, add in a bit more sort of clarity, or maybe an example or two, or a variant that helps split this up a little bit, so it's easier to include in your game. Perfect. Okay, well, I think that's 6 questions asked and answered. I have a few more in the pipeline, but I'll probably hold on to those for the next episode, or sort of slowly build up a stock for future episodes and installments, unless there is anyone in chat that has anything you'd like to ask or watch me ramble and talk about. But by all means, throw something out there. Otherwise, we might just watch me talk about, there's always the Monster Maker web app upcoming changes that I might just dip into while I await further questions. Cool. So, in addition to the light rules here that hopefully I'm gonna get to finish this week, I'm also working on a brand new form fillable character sheet, just an update that will fix some form errors and also include the calendar and equipment and spell pages in a fully form fillable state. I have also it still needs a tiny bit of testing, but added in some fixes and expansions for the Monster Maker web app, which, again, if you're not familiar, this is a tool that I have created and released for free. You can access it from my Giffyglyph site. That allows you to build monsters. And you can either build them using my quick start rules from the Monster Maker supplement. You can see here that this sort of includes, you can easily set the level standards and what role it is and what rank and how many players is it fighting, etc., etc. And then you can download these as PNGs. You can save them to your vault so that you can access them in the future. And then that vault, you can export to JSON and then save that for later. Or if you open up a monster, you can export, or you can save that as a sort of improved initiative format, so you can import that easily there. Or in GM binder format, we can see that. So you can just copy that and paste that into your GM binder document. And hopefully that will sort of streamline things a lot for people. There were a couple of things that I needed to add to this, just to sort of round some of those off. And it's nearly complete. I will just run you through some of the upcoming changes that hopefully will drop tomorrow, or sort of later during the week. So a quick button down here, just so you can easily switch between 1-column and 2-column layouts. That I found was it was annoying for me to have to switch back to display and change the column here, when I could just add a button that quickly does that for me. I've added a default theme, or rather a default option. So now in the settings, I can set whatever theme I want to be the default for all my monsters. Let's say I want the default for all of my monsters to look like 5th edition. Oh, here it is. Now it's 5th edition. It's still using the default. If for this particular one I want it to look like the diamond theme, perfect. Or maybe I want it to look like the new, upcoming Giffyglyph theme. And this is using a similar kind of style to the stat blocks here in the Monster Maker document. It's slightly changed on these attributes here, just to better support sort of like the text and the compatibility between quick start monsters and the raw 5th edition monsters. So that will be coming out shortly once I fix it up. There's a few issues just with that layout. But one of the main, in fact, the main issue for, or the main feature of this one is being able to import all of the starting SRD 5th edition monsters. So at the moment, this is my vault, it's completely empty. But if I want to import 322 monsters into it, just to get started with, it's done. And as you can see, this includes the full character sort of stat block for all of the SRD free 5th edition monsters. So we have, like, you know, here's the Aboleth stat block, and you know, I can change the theme of this one, render it however I want. I could attach an image to it if I wanted. You know, now I can just sort of easily search for any of these sort of standard 5th edition monsters and export them sort of how and as I want. You know, I can take this, here we go, it's in GM Binder format, copy, paste, and there's your document. A few extra sort of help modals just to kind of clarify some extra features, and I think that's the main change that we're coming up in this one. There are a couple of other sort of minor bug fixes, but nothing significant or nothing that will change your existing monster vault. This will only sort of expand it. I believe that is it. Yeah, I think so. Cool. Fantastic. Well, if there are no more questions for tonight, I think we got through 6 very good ones. Thank you everyone for all of your contributions and you know, questions and your general support. I guess we'll draw a line under this one, and I'll see you all next week. But first, a special thank you to all of my patrons. Your ongoing support is really appreciated. You know, it's always nice to know that other people enjoy your work, or certainly enjoy it enough to pay a little bit of money for it, which is really kind and considerate. So a special thank you to Adivice Stragia, Anthony Campler, Brady, Douglas, J.M. Sundon, and Seth Cooper. And in addition to that, thank you to all of the glyphs and all of you Rune supporters as well. Like I say, your contributions really mean a lot, and it's very much appreciated. Before I go, thinking about it, there was a very nice let me find. There has been a campaign run by the people at Can We Play Tweets, who have just completed like the sort of first season of a campaign that they have been running with the Darker Dungeons rule set, sort of using parts of that in their game, like week-long rests and spell burnout and randomized character generation and all that kind of stuff. They have just completed the first season, and they've done a sort of post game. There's like a 2-hour kind of long review of some of the rules that they have used in this here. So can we play already? You're looking at their DM chat about running the game. These are really good people on stream. Really enjoyed watching this, and if you have any sort of questions or queries about how Darker Dungeons might affect your game, you should watch this, because they chat about how the rules impacted their game, and more importantly, they really loved it. So that was really cool to watch and hear about. So I think we'll leave it there. There we go. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. I've been Giffyglyph. This has been Social Encounter, and I'll see you all next week. Bye.